Welcome, everyone. For those who do not know, I am Megan Clark. I'm an associate professor of moral theology in our theology department here at St. John's. Along with my co-chair, Victoria O'Keefe, we coordinate St. John's Catholic Relief Service Global Campus Committee. And one of the things that we do throughout the academic year is organize panels and lectures that seek to broaden our conversations and create space for us to have inter and cross-disciplinary conversations about matters of peace and global justice. And tonight we will be looking at rethinking systemic approaches to poverty, looking at universal basic income and direct cash to the poor as ways that can effectively promote not only better economic justice, but resilience and agency, greater agency among persons who are living in poverty. To get us started, we will begin briefly with prayer, and then I will introduce our topic and our speakers a little bit more. So if you can all join me. And this prayer it's called Awaken Us from Catholic Relief Services website. Lord of all hopefulness, awaken us. Show us the meaning in our toil, that we may ever rejoice in the promise of the seeds we sow. Lord of all righteousness, awaken us. Show us the good path, that we may walk in confidence in your wisdom and understanding. Lord of all hospitality, awaken us. Show us the refuge of eagle's wings, that we may always be people of shelter in times of storm. Lord of our freedom, awaken us. Show us the courage that called our forefathers and foremothers out of bondage, that we may always stand with the bound and oppressed, and be their champions. Lord of all peace, awaken us. Show us the heart that stills even raging waters, that we may make still raging hearts and reconcile. Lord of all charity, awaken us. Teach us of the unending return on our sacrifice, that we may rejoice more fully in our giving. Lord, you have eyes for the just and ears for their cry. Awaken in us a heart of justice, that you may count us among their number. Amen. I chose that prayer when I was looking for something that fit the broader kind of reach for why I think tonight's conversation is important. And part of what drew me to it is the fact that through a whole host of different events going on at the same time, we seem to be at a moment where finally people are to an extent awakened and willing to consider what listening to the voices of people who are struggling, listen to the experiences of the poor in a way that sets aside at least a little bit an overwhelming kind of barrier that has been at least in American culture for pretty much since its founding, but the deep suspicion with which people approach thinking about poverty and the stigmas that go along with assumptions that get made. The pandemic has forced people to think differently. The impetus for tonight's event came as I saw how many young people especially were intrigued by Andrew Yang and the way in which he was able to create a new conversation, particularly because he was able to bring in younger people to think outside of the box and addressing it to individuals who maybe haven't quite formed such a hard and fast barrier to the idea that sometimes the problem really is as simple as people do not have enough reliable cash. And that it isn't because they are doing anything wrong that is the case. And so we began planning and thinking about how we could have tonight's conversation. And so I'm going to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers and then ask them to share their wisdom with us. Dina Brick is Senior Technical Advisor for Food Security and Markets at Catholic Relief Services. As a member of CRS's Humanitarian Response Team, Dina heads CRS's Market-Based Rapid Response and Recovery Team. This global team supports cash and market-based programming in pre-crisis, emergency, and early recovery contexts in over 50 countries. Dina supports cash-based programs for basic needs and also promotes market-based responses to address food security problems. She has over 15 years of experience in international agriculture, food security, and cash and market programs, both overseas and in the United States. She also holds a master's degree from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Dr. Evelyn Forget is an economist, professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba, and academic director of the Manitoba Research Data Center. She's an adjunct scientist with the Manitoba Center for Health Policy and a research associate with the MB First Nations Center for Aboriginal Health Research. Her work has been funded by many groups, including the NIH, and she has consulted for provincial and federal government departments, First Nations, and NGOs. Her current research focuses on the health and social consequences of anti-poverty interventions and the cost-effectiveness of healthcare interventions. Dr. Forget has been an expert trying to get everybody's attention on basic income for much longer than Andrew Yang. Kate Ward is an assistant professor of theological ethics at Marquette University. Dr. Ward's research engages economic ethics, virtue ethics, and Catholic social thought. She is the author of Wealth, Virtue, and Moral Luck, Christian Ethics in an Age of Inequality, forthcoming from Georgetown University Press. Dr. Ward has her PhD in theological ethics from Boston College, an MDiv from Chicago Theological Union, and her bachelor's from Harvard. All of you have a wealth of expertise, and I am really excited for not only your answers to my questions, but also for our conversation together. I said that we've been getting more attention and people have been more interested in basic income lately and cash programs to not just as a poverty response, right? But we see this in Congress across in terms of the direct payments as part of COVID relief. As the daughter of an economist who also was writing on basic income in the 1990s when everybody was thought it was unfeasible and fringe, COVID has opened up for people a space where they're having to face their own biases and assumptions that maybe were not the case. I want to start by asking Evelyn, you've been working on basic income as it's evolved and as economics has thought about it. Can you share a little bit of that history and where we find ourselves now in terms of thinking about basic income as a policy option and what you think about this moment?
Well, basic income is certainly having its moment. I started looking seriously at basic income about 15 years ago. I'm a health economist, and my office is in a teaching hospital in the center of Winnipeg, in one of the poorest districts in Canada. And it became very obvious to me very quickly that we were using our healthcare system to treat the consequences of poverty. And I remembered a lot of experiments that had taken place in North America in the 1970s, the negative income tax experiments in the United States. There were 4 of them. Well, there was one in Canada as well. And fortunately for me, one of them took place in the province where I work in Manitoba. And so I went back to find some of the data associated with that experiment because I wanted to find out what kind of a difference it made in people's lives if they received a basic income. And in the middle of that research, along came the 2008 market crash, and suddenly people were talking about basic income. When I first started looking at it, it really was a fringe idea. 2008 came along, and suddenly people were talking about robots and changing labor markets and how we were all looking forward to a world without work. And so I was a bit taken aback by all of that. But I followed the 2008 crisis, and then it ended, and our attention sort of drifted away. As the economy recovered, we stopped paying quite so much attention to basic income. So, plugging along, there were a lot of people working on basic income, but then COVID came along and suddenly, boom, all kinds of things happened. Suddenly, a lot of middle-class people who never thought that they would be in a position to rely on government programs found that the kinds of government programs we had in place really weren't up to the job, that they'd been created for a different kind of a world and a different kind of a labor market. And governments too were being put on the hook in both Canada and the United States and around the world, recognizing that, large numbers of middle-class people are a lot noisier than large numbers of marginalized people who are used to living off the crumbs and not complaining very much. And so they worried about how they were going to change these programs. And the conversation started to consider a lot of things that they hadn't thought very much about in the past, including things like direct cash transfers. And so now we find ourselves in this really interesting position all over the world where people are experimenting with new ways of getting money into the hands of people and wondering what kind of a difference it would make. So I look at the US, for example, and I see all these wonderful experiments that are taking place in cities all over the US, under the guidance of activist mayors. And that's an incredible thing to watch. And I'm listening to all this conversation in the US about the child benefit. We've had a child benefit in place in Canada for a couple of years, and it's halved the poverty rate among children. Just a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, in fact, the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada released a report saying that if we introduced a basic income for working age adults in Canada, we could cut the poverty rate in half in Canada without introducing any new taxes, without cutting back on any social programs, simply by taking a lot of things that we were already doing and doing them better, right? Taking a lot of tax expenditures, taking a lot of social programs, and delivering them in an efficient way, in a way that recognizes the humanity of people who use them, that recognizes the value of their time and their ability to make their own decisions about how to live their life. And we could fundamentally transform society. So when I hear organizations like the Parliamentary Budget Office, sort of our counterpart of the Congressional Budget Office, making arguments like that, we've come a long way from basic income being this fringe idea, that people were talking about in the 1990s. At the same time, I worry about where we are right now because I look at the huge deficits and I listen to the conversation about the debt that's sort of bubbling there, and I don't know where we're going forward. I know that there's a lot of energy and a lot of interest in basic income, but we've watched that energy and that interest fade when the economy recovers and we go back to the way we've been doing things for a long time. So I think we're at this really important point, this pivot, and I think it's really incumbent on all of us to force people to continue to recognize what it is we've learned during this pandemic.
I think the point you made at the end is certainly one that a lot of us are focused on, this sense of, we have to make sure and make our voices heard, that we do not, that lessons are learned and remembered, right? Not just that survival happens and then we go, people go back to normal. You also noted, and this is in Catholic social thought, this is a point that Pope Francis has been emphasizing, especially when he went to the United Nations, and that the purpose of how we respond to poverty and to crises should be to increase the ability of persons to be agents of their own development and their own destiny. Dina, this is something that you work on directly in the global context in the area of humanitarian aid. And there too, we've seen both resistance to by funders and governments, as well as the importance of direct cash transfers to those living in poverty. Can you share a little with us from your experience about what you've seen and what you've learned in your work with CRS, especially working with people affected by disasters and the importance that direct cash programs have on addressing their needs?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I can speak to international humanitarian assistance in the form of cash. This is not exactly universal basic income, but I think there's a lot of lessons actually from this experience and how it's quite similar. And there are initiatives in humanitarian cash transfers in terms of linking up with government social protection systems in other countries too. But these often range from one-time cash transfers up to maybe often humanitarian funding is about 6 to 18 months. So it could be short-term or they could be up to sort of 18 months. Sometimes they're timed around a hungry season or a lean season in a country. The aim of cash in emergencies in a crisis, this is a time when people have lost, in some cases, everything: family, home. They've lost their agency, they've lost their ability to make decisions, to have control over resources to be able to support their families. So one of the important aims, I think, of cash transfers in the humanitarian context, which I think is probably relevant in universal basic income discussion too, is providing people with the recognition that we understand that they know what's best for their families and they're able to make decisions for themselves in terms of their recovery. A secondary impact or importance of cash transfers in emergencies is the sort of secondary impact on the economy. So giving cash to a person, they're going to be spending it locally. So having this income or this sort of ripple effect in the economies. These are sometimes markets that have been devastated. And what we've seen in the past is that providing in-kind assistance sometimes, while well-intentioned, can sometimes be replacing even those local market systems that exist. So actually making it harder for people to dig out. Interestingly, in the past few years, cash has really increased. The most recent figures I've seen from 2019 are that about 18% of total international humanitarian assistance, so about $5.5 billion, has been in the form of cash and voucher assistance. This is about double from 3 years prior. And there are estimates that probably between about 40% plus, sometimes up to, depending on the kind of program, even 90% of cash of humanitarian assistance could be in the form of cash. And the shift really came about in about 2015, 2016, there was a World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul. And linked to that was this initiative called the Grand Bargain, which the subtext of the subheading of Grand Bargain was too important to fail. This work is too big for us to screw it up, basically. It's too important to people's lives. And it was about financial responsibility and how we are accountable to the populations we serve. And one of the commitments under that Grand Bargain, which was there are signatories among NGOs such as CRS, but also states and private sector, UN, was a commitment to increase the use of cash. This was a big shift from 5 or 6 years ago. I know there are people in the audience that probably said, we've been talking about this for decades, right? But in terms of it being more of a mainstream idea, similar to Evelyn, what you were mentioning with COVID, in 2015 also, there was a paper that came out called Why Not Cash? It was from Overseas Development Institute. And it basically was flipping the paradigm. In the past, I, as a program manager, would have to justify, this is why we should be using cash instead of an in-kind transfer. Now they were flipping this dynamic to say, you should actually start with cash as your entry point and have to justify why you shouldn't be using it. And some of this came from that there has been a lot of impact that has been seen in terms of outcomes, like a recent program we had in Gaza. Over 90% of people were self-reporting that with these cash transfers, they were able to meet all or most of their basic needs. Some of them are kind of focused on not general well-being, but also, for example, food is a big expense for this population in general, right? Food is one of the main basic needs. So often food security indicators might be used as a proxy for well-being. And in a recent evaluation I just read in Haiti, the consumption of food had increased, meaning the diversity and the frequency of food consumption had increased threefold. Nutrition isn't always affected, and I know there are some people, this is sort of getting to us trying to micromanage what people are using their cash for, and they want to see that there are nutritional gains or something like that. That's probably not going to move. There are structural other barriers to micronutrition, to micronutrient deficiencies, for example. But anyway, there's pretty much across the boards, there's always some kind of real movement in terms of well-being. And also high levels of beneficiary satisfaction. There's a group called Ground Truth Solutions that really, as all of us are running around doing our programs, they actually go and they talk to participants and they ask them questions about how was this cash delivered? How was this program delivered? Were your needs considered, et cetera? And quite consistently, people often have preferences for cash. There was a recent study in Central African Republic that cash recipients were more likely to believe that aid was improving their lives at present and that would help them to live without needing aid in the future than if they were not receiving it. So a couple of quick thoughts just to leave out in the world. One thing that I've seen is that a continued challenge, despite this real shift towards recognizing agency of people, is that there still is in the international humanitarian space, and I see it domestically too, just as a citizen of the US, is that giving recipients real choice, it is a hard thing to do, right? It's hard to let go of what we think people need. We have, in the humanitarian land, have said, we've done our needs assessment, people have told us that they need this, so we're going to give you this. Well, a village is a microcosm of thousands of people with many different needs, and not everybody needs all that stuff that some people told us that they need. The same Central African Republic study that I cited earlier also said that 68% of people sold at least some part of their aid that they received in kind. So we didn't get it right, but that concept really shook people up. This is something that we do. We really hold on to it, and giving cash and letting people make decisions is it's a shift. Another thing I would say is that there still is, well, this has shifted significantly. There still is a mistrust of the poor and what decisions that they know how to make. And Megan, you alluded to this in your opening, right? That people will buy booze and cigarettes, and we can't support that with our donor funding. Part of this is contributing factors that there aren't really good metrics for how people are spending cash. Cash is fungible, sort of by definition. It's difficult to know. It's kind of a ridiculous question in a way too, right? Like, what do you spend the $20 I just gave you versus the $20 you already had in your pocket? It's just a hard metric to really get if we care about those metrics at all. But there has been a shift towards a real recognition that people know what is best for them. And they often do the best with what they can, and they're the drivers of their own self-recovery. But it still is a shift that is continuing to happen. And then the last thing I'll say is that with this shift towards sort of a more people-centered approach, one thing I have seen, and this is from a cash file, and I am a real advocate, is that cash alone is not always the only response. So that's another thing too, is that as we're entering into communities and part of this process of understanding what are people's needs, there's also recognition that often people do prefer cash, but often it might be in addition to something else. In some cases, like in Northeast Nigeria with the Boko Haram, I was reading that there was big proportion of the population that actually preferred to receive food in kind in addition to cash. So just thinking about also the need for us to be listening to the populations, and really, which is another part of agency, right? Making sure that we're actually hearing what they're saying and listening to them. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I mean, much of what you've noted, I think has plagued a lot of the conversations. This sense of right, your response has to be one way or the other. And so it's either cash or it's talking about structures and systems. And it's frustrating because I've never learned about or studied any sort of social policy problem wherein there is one, right, where one fix is what fixes it all. I mean, with COVID, we know that simply vaccines are not on their own a sufficient fix if we also don't kind of outrun the new variants and continue to wear masks and whatnot. That they're kind of anytime we're looking for a silver bullet, that's the magic is usually a bad sign in terms of what happens. And the suspicion domestically in the United States, the suspicion of the poor, and I imagine we'll talk a little bit about this as we have our kind of second go round in the conversation, is tied to a particular type of legacy of, well, you're supposed to be able, if you are a good and virtuous, hardworking person, a particular hardline Protestant work ethic, Calvinist sense of determinism that plays out. But globally, especially when so much of those making the decisions come out, right, are tied to the United States and cultures that have that kind of suspicion, right, that also gets applied to people and systems in the global South without any recognition of the factors of things like colonialism and the political ways in which there have been barriers from the global North to their developing their own agency and resilient social systems of their own. And this has also played out in some conversations and the way that these are getting talked about or not in Catholic social thought from the ethics side. And I'd like to ask Kate, who's been part of a number of debates and these things recently, and it's kind of struck me as really kind of unsettling. But we've been hearing voices in the United States and in Europe in particular trying to claim that basic income programs, and honestly, if you follow their criticism and it holds, it would apply to cash transfer programs in development aid and humanitarian assistance as well, that these are not in keeping with Catholic social teaching's vision of work, justice, and family. And so I'd like to ask Kate, as an ethicist, can you share with us how or why, and I know you've been making this argument in just about every venue you can these days, that this is just wrong, that Catholic social thought does support using approaches like basic income and cash transfer programs as a way to address poverty.
Thank you. So Catholic social thought is the body of teaching from Catholic popes looking at the world and particularly political and economic life, and reflecting on the realities of the world through Catholic teaching, and suggesting how Catholic teaching can help us build a better and more just world. And so, like Meg said, I have been thinking about this from a Catholic perspective for a while, and my job has recently gotten a whole lot easier because, as you probably know, Pope Francis has been speaking out on behalf of universal basic income. So I could just say, thank you, good night, but I won't, because it's interesting to hear about why he supports it too. So the Catholic Church has always held that basic needs are a human right, and not just that, but that when we say that that's a right, that presumes duties on societies to help make sure everyone can attain those basic needs, food, shelter, education, and those kind of things, which help us live our lives as humans with dignity. So a lot of folks in the US, I think, without thinking too much about it, say, yeah, sure, you have a right to those things. You're free to go out and buy them on the open market, which means that if you can't afford whatever at the prevailing market price, you can't, in essence, exercise that right. And the popes have consistently said that's kind of a mockery of the concept of what it means to have a right. To have a right means that you're actually supported in achieving this thing. Also, that for government to even impose taxes and to have social programs to help people achieve their basic needs is something the Catholic tradition is very comfortable with. Because, and again, I would contrast this with a prevailing view in the US. Government isn't seen as something that's kind of this big bad thing out there over you, interfering with your life, but it's really seen as the creation of what people want to do, right? Which doesn't mean that government is perfect or always gets it right, but in its inherent essence, it's a legitimate project, right? If what you have is a functioning democratic government or one that meaningfully represents the needs of its citizens. So you can have social programs to meet basic needs. They can be funded by taxes. So far, so good. So specifically, what about basic income feels different from a Catholic perspective? And I think what's going on when people challenge basic income is a misunderstanding of another key part of Catholic teaching, which is that work is a good thing for humans, and it's sometimes framed as work is a duty. And I'm going to say this is true, right? That is part of the Catholic tradition. Work is a duty for humans. But I think what folks who point to that are missing is that that teaching is not meant to be limited to waged work, right? So we would say any kind of purposeful, productive, creative human activity is a duty for humans. And that's what the Catholic tradition says is work. So obviously, right, caregiving work in the home, it's work. We all know, we're all doing a lot more of it lately. That's work. We don't envision that as being waged work. That could be part of humans' duty, right? Doing creative activity like making a garden, making art, writing. There's so many ways people do these kinds of things on the internet, and I don't think they even realize they're engaging in work, but writing fanfic, reviewing things. This is really putting something out there in the world that someone else needs and can benefit from. And incidentally, it makes money, by the way, for the internet company that you're using to communicate this. These are all ways we as humans exercise our creative faculty. So CST would say, there are lots of ways that humans work in the world. I've only named very few of them. To do something creative and good that benefits others and develops your own abilities is a duty. But the tradition specifically says we're not saying that waged work is a duty, because that would have a lot of unpleasant downstream effects, right? We don't want all parents of young children to have to work for wages. We don't want people who, are limited in their abilities due to age, disability, or youth. We're not saying that waged work is what's required. So I think when folks use that teaching to discredit UBI, they're misrepresenting the teaching on work. Let's see. I think I'll stop there for now. I have a lot more I could say, but I'll throw it back to everyone.
That sets up where I was hoping to ask you all next, which is this sense of the nature of work. Both what we see in kind of domestic settings, but also in communities that are experiencing a particular disaster, which is impeding their regular settings. This basic income, or this influx of cash, but Dina mentioned the economic impact of direct cash humanitarian programs have, because you're buying things in the local economy, over and against the fact that a lot of times, if you're simply providing things in kind, those items and that money isn't necessarily going into, they're not necessarily things that come from the local, which has often been one of the critiques of previous things like USAID policy for where they sourced things like rice and food over the decades. This sense of not only is there required a broader sense of work, but also a broader sense of economic activity, and how one participates in and expands the economy. And so I'd like to kind of have us pause there for a minute about the both the assumptions that people make about work and the poor, as well as what we see if we have a broader sense of both work and economic impact. And so I'll start by asking Evelyn to correct me if I'm wrong, but what the pilot studies and what the economic studies have shown is that basic income and cash programs actually increase people's work productivity and increase their economic impact as well, rather than curtailing it. Can you say a little bit about what in reality has been shown when people actually do give it a try?
Very little evidence that basic income or cash transfers reduce people's work effort. We've just done a major meta-analysis of basic income experiments and also basic income-like programs, so cash transfer programs. And the best estimate we can come up with is that if we were to roll out a basic income, we might see a reduction in work effort by as much as 1.3%. Now, if you think about 1.3%, that's about half an hour a week on average. That's 2 coffee breaks, right? This is not enough to cripple the economy. This is not a massive effect. When you look at specific studies, you do see the kinds of increases you're talking about. So the recent studies in Finland, for example, and in the Netherlands, there was no difference between people who received a basic income and the control group in terms of the number of hours worked. But there was a difference in terms of the kind of work people were able to find. So people who received a basic income very often were much more likely to be moving into permanent full-time work by the end of the experiment, as opposed to the people who were receiving the standard programs and who were much more likely to be in precarious temporary work. So empirically, there's no indication that people work less if you offer them a basic income.
Dina, does the academic analysis studies and the economic studies track with what you see in communities in terms of the work and the types of work and the economic impact of cash programs on small communities?
It does. I mean, Evelyn, what you said is, yeah, I would say that's exactly what I see. And even in cash transfer programs overseas, there is this concept of a conditional cash transfer, which is basically cash for work, meaning you do a job and I'll pay you for it, or an unconditional cash transfer. And the same dynamic that you were just describing exists in that too, that there's sort of a, it's easier in some cultures and some contexts to be trying to pay someone for the work that they're doing. Whereas in a lot of cases, that's not appropriate, right? People, women especially, already are working 125% of their time in the home, as well as taking care of the children, as well as in the field, as well as whatever. And if we're asking them to work on top of that in order to get this income, we're just going to have a negative, on balance, a negative impact on the household. And also what you were saying, Evelyn, you know, the duration and the types of cash grants also, I think, would play into some of these outcomes. For example, evidence is showing that a larger tranche, a larger cash transfer, people are more likely to invest in their livelihoods, for example, rather than if there was like smaller cash transfers over time, where people are probably, it's more of a consumption smoothing. People are more likely to spend it on basic needs. So that kind of dynamic also I've seen at play too. But yeah, definitely, depending on the type of cash transfer, there is as Evelyn was suggesting at the end, a greater likelihood of people being able to regain their livelihoods and to be able to regain the work that they had been doing in the past, and or start a new livelihood, for example, too.
There was an interesting article this week on a pilot in Washington, D.C., and how in one particular case, someone who had started a small business, what they used the influx of cash for was to buy a used car. because relying on public transit in order to deliver the goods that they were making, right? And so that came to mind when you said people invest in their livelihoods in ways that if they're worried about paying rent, they don't necessarily feel that they can kind of take that risk and try to invest in that way. We see the connections, and you know, the evidence ends up confirming this, whether it is a study in northern Kenya, in a rural village, or in Finland, or in Canada, right? That these things hold across countries' levels of development. Now, other things that are required in order for human flourishing may differ between contexts. And yet for countries like the United States, and the US in particular has a much less extensive social protection network than Canada or than Western Europe. Kate, I'm wondering, as an ethicist, what you think might be done, or how you think we help raise up these stories in a way that effectively chips away at eliminating this separating of people into the deserving or the undeserving poor, or the deep desire, this overwhelming desire that is present in American culture, which somehow wishes to see wealth as a sign of goodness and holiness, when there's just no, as we look around history, there's not a whole lot of evidence to point to. And yet this deep sense that is there, that seems to be a barrier of suspicion that somehow people are to blame, and therefore we should make the poor suffer. That's seems to be an overriding problem in getting Americans to get on board, both with cash programs in developing countries and caring for our neighbors here at home.
Yes, absolutely. I can tell you how I think theological imagination helps us get there, and then what I think might help for those who aren't as easily swayed by that, because a lot of folks who do hold these biases that we've been talking about against people in poverty are, religious, and specifically are Christians and would identify that way. But I think we should be able to say, for Christians who see their lives as affected by theological truth, we all have received something that we didn't deserve, right? Which is being created by God and being loved by God. So how can we say to someone else, you don't deserve help from another person? I think that's really quite perverse. Now, in terms of public discourse, I might go with the data, and that's something that I think is wonderful, that UBI has been so extensively tested, and that the results show, it's effective, as both of you are saying, that it doesn't diminish paid work in ways that would be harmful, because there is that, it appeals to that sort of maybe overly rationalistic side, I think, of people that like to say, well, when someone's saying, well, that just won't work, right? They're making an argument about data. So if you have better data to show them, maybe I shouldn't say this as an ethicist. I think I would bet on that rather than the theological appeal.
As a fellow ethicist, I unfortunately agree with you. I wish the argument from within religious communities, particularly within American Christianity, and all worked better than it does seem to. The interesting thing on the data is that the data also universally shows that an extension of what happens here is improved physical and mental, particularly mental health, and an improved resilience. That in the chat, somebody sent in a note about the noting that poverty in different places is often radically different. But one of the things that's been interesting about these studies in terms of the COVID period is that the giant Give Directly pilot program that happened in rural Kenya, COVID has wiped out a whole lot of the economic gains in terms of the economic surpluses that, right, and these small businesses that had been growing now are constricting because the country shut down because of COVID. And yet the communities that were part of the Give Directly basic income program have shown significantly better resilience and health during COVID, in particularly resilience and mental health, than the communities that didn't have. And so I'm curious to see what each of you think in terms of these programs as a way not only to deal with material poverty, but also as something that can really build health and well-being and resilience, right? Really help get us to structure things more for human flourishing. And if that's something that you all see as a benefit here beyond just the economics at play. I open it up to whoever would like to respond first. I'm not sure who would like to. I know Evelyn has done extensive work on the health in particular, and Dina has been in the field. So if both of you would like to say something on how you think resilience plays out in these conversations and what you've seen during COVID.
One thing I can start, Evelyn, on the question of what we've seen during COVID in particular. Megan, to that question, one thing that I think is quite interesting actually is, as we're speaking about social protection programs across the world, we're mostly speaking about US and Canada and Europe, but with the onset of COVID, this comes from World Bank, Ugo Gentilini, who has done a lot of work on looking at cash and social protection. I think this data is from January, but over the 9 months prior to January, there had been $800 billion in social protection transfers, about a third of which were in the form of cash. And this represented like a 240% increase from the past. So, and reaching over 1 billion people. So 15% of the world's population. So just to note that with this is a global pandemic and it has had global proportions, and what we have seen in the US in terms of small business owners not being able to make it, this is sort of amplified in places where, these are day laborers, for example, that rely on daily wages, right? And those businesses are gone. They have zero income. I mean, the decreases in income during the lockdowns have been really incredible. I saw like 20% increase in the number of people living in poverty or below the poverty line. So just to say that the COVID crisis really sort of shone a light on the importance of cash and cash responses, and the social protection system did respond. However, a lot of those were short-term. They were like 3 months or less. In a lot of these contexts, if they're affected by conflict, or if the governments aren't that strong, or if like the government lists maybe aren't really fair, there still were a lot of people that fell through the cracks. So I guess I'm answering a slightly different question, but picking up on your COVID piece, yeah, just to note that the social protection systems that have a long way to go, but there have been some really significant increases in that over the past year, I would say.
To see how infectious diseases, for example, impact most heavily on low-income neighborhoods or in people working in low-wage jobs where protections aren't there. And we see that as being a very obvious kind of a thing. I think it's harder for people who don't work in the area of health to imagine how chronic conditions, for example, are affected by cash transfers. If you think about the Canadian context, we have universal healthcare, so we're told. Everybody has access to decent primary care. And yet I look at data for type 2 diabetes, and there's not a strong association with income, but there's a very strong association with complications due to type 2 diabetes. Lower limb amputations, people getting their foot cut off because of poor circulation. It's about 3 times higher among the poorest 20% of people. That's an ambulatory care sensitive condition. And what that means is that if you've got access to decent primary care, nobody should be having their foot amputated in a high income country because of diabetes. It just shouldn't happen. So why is it that low income people are 3 times more likely to have their foot amputated due to complications of diabetes? And I think if you think about all the different ways that both material deprivation and other kinds of things impact on people, you begin to see how pervasive poverty is and how some of that stigma is in fact driving the results. So some of it's fairly obvious. You need to manage your diet if you're diabetic. If you don't have enough cash, you don't eat well. You're more likely to be working and living in conditions where your feet could be injured. You might not have cash for transportation or for childcare to go to medical appointments. But there's also the stigma that's associated with poverty. And in a high-income country like the United States, like Canada, feet and teeth are real markers of class, right? Informal markers of class. And people are embarrassed. Their poverty's on display. You go to a doctor and the doctor will treat you, but you go with your no socks and your old shoes, and your poverty is on immediate display and people are embarrassed. They're embarrassed to access the healthcare that's available to them. There are so many ways that those kinds of attitudes, I think, drive our society, and people have such a hard time, even accessing the services that are already in place. We see the same thing with mental health issues. There's a really strong correlation between poverty and poor mental health. And it's a very complicated relationship, of course. But again, accessing the services becomes very, very difficult for people without the cash to do that, without the cash to participate in a meaningful way in the society in which they live.
Thank you. We're definitely seeing that all of those intricate relationships right now in a way that has always been the reality for people living in poverty in the United States. But because it's now affecting people in the middle class in certain ways because of COVID, people, I say to my students all the time, a natural disaster, right, in which I would put COVID in that kind of thing, whether it be a typhoon, a hurricane, or a pandemic, often acts as a giant spotlight on the injustices that were there in the first place. It makes everything worse, but an awful lot of kind of who's able to recover and who's not is about how things were before, not the disaster itself. I mean, and we've certainly seen the way having cash or not in terms of being able to, not just whether or not you have a job you can do from home, but all the ways in which to lower and mitigate your risk of exposure to COVID assumes a significant amount of privilege. Being able to have food orders delivered and be able to pay extra for things in ways, your own transportation to avoid public transit, all of these things. We have a number of questions that have come in from the attendees. The first of which is, given all of this, and I'll pose this to Evelyn and Kate. What and about 3 or 4 people asked this question in different ways. How do you think, or what do you think would be the best path in order to adopt something like a basic income in the United States? What structures, what possibilities, how do you think would be best to accomplish this?
Can I speak to that? One thing that gives me a lot of hope is the conversation about the child benefit right now. Only because, you know, it's not the same as a basic income, but in my lifetime, the US has been so resistant to the idea of cash aid even to children, right? Or to the parents of children in poverty. So just the fact that we're talking about this, you know, initially our welfare system was designed to allow moms, and at the time only moms in poverty, to stay home with their kids. And then President Clinton, Bill Clinton, undid that. Now we're in a situation where welfare programs in most states expect moms of very young babies to be working or looking for work. And families in working poverty who aren't receiving benefits might be even worse off. And there was a statistic that over 20% of moms are back to work within 2 weeks after having a baby, which, you know, as someone who has had a baby, is an absolute scandal that our country should be just so ashamed of. So the fact that we're finally opening our eyes to the idea that, you know, people deserve help, right? That the greatest good for society is not to have everyone working for wages all the time. I think that's a hopeful move.
I think I'd echo that. I think we've certainly seen a lot more acceptance of cash transfer programs in Canada as a consequence of the child benefit. There's much less political resistance to a child benefit than there is to benefits for working age adults, because, you know, nobody expects children to be out in the labor market working in the US. So, I mean, the benefit is more politically acceptable. And when many families begin to receive it, they begin to see the benefits that are associated with that. They begin to see the improved educational scores for children, for example, when their families don't have to move from apartment to apartment, and there's some stability in their schooling, in their education. And I think that makes the population more open to the idea that cash transfers might be a reasonable way forward. I should say that I'm not really a purist in terms of basic income. I mean, whatever works. And I do think it probably is very different in different contexts, in different political contexts. So I'm really not very comfortable saying what the best way forward might be in the US. But I think building on successful programs that already exist is always much easier than trying to upend an entire system and start over.
And I suspect, as has happened, how social protection has worked in the United States whenever there has been progress. Once people receive and they experience, as you noted, right, they experience the impact it has, but also once they get used to it as a part of things, it's very, very different to argue to take away something than it is to argue about whether or not you should start a program. And this, you know, the world over, you know, any argument about privatizing the NHS in the UK, despite all its faults, falls into this. In the US, debates about the Affordable Care Act and repealing it has fallen into this. Once people have something that is a guaranteed protection, the prospect of removing it becomes a very different political conversation than whether or not to start it. Another of the questions from our viewers is how one of the things that came out is, and Evelyn, you alluded to this in terms of the not being a purist, right? And everybody part of this conversation, all of you have agreed that it isn't a one size fits all. You know, if we have universal basic income in all, you know, 192 countries, that number might not be right, then we'll have no poverty and everything will be fixed. But that right, that it can be an important part, direct cash programs can be an important part of. And so two people have asked kind of what ideas do you have for how to navigate and create approaches that are flexible in order to in order to have cash transfer when it's needed, but also still have the other programs, other structures, other kind of aid in kind, and domestically that would be other kind of existent parts of social programs that we have in addition to whatever might come from the child benefit or a basic income. Dina, what have you learned, or what ideas do you have for ways to think about how to have the needed flexibility while still having having what you need, but built into that the flexibility to really respond to what a particular community needs?
That's a good question. There has been a lot of discussion about multiple modality programs, meaning a cash transfer alongside something else. There's also been there's a lot of discussion, which actually Evelyn and Kate, you sort of alluded to also, of cash plus care, for example, or cash plus other kinds of kind of structural support, institutional support, etc. And that has been gaining traction in international humanitarian work. And I think it's actually really important. Just because, well, I mean, it's so contextual, right? Like a program is going to meet, it just has to really depend on what people's needs are in a given country. One of the constraints, honestly, has been donor funding. And to be frank, USAID took a while to come around to cash programming being an open, like something that they're really embracing. And even so, even now, with quite openness compared with what it used to be, there still are some challenges with Congress and what is possible in terms of international humanitarian assistance anyway. So there are still barriers from our own government side, which I hear reflected in this discussion also on our domestic programming. But yeah, I'll stop there just to say that I have found, and there is evidence also on the real benefit of having cash transfers as part of a bigger program. So, and especially in the health sector, Evelyn, as you've sort of alluded to also, right? Like providing support to caregivers of orphans and vulnerable children, through a cash transfer, but also providing them with health services. This has like exponential impact change, rather than just providing a cash transfer.
In your work at CRS, and this came in as a CRS specific question, and a couple of weeks ago we had an event for faculty where Tom Shaw talked about CRS's Silk program, and a question came in terms of, do you see Silk programming as something that influences in communities and influences as a structural element alongside building kind of people cash. For those who don't know, it's the Savings and Internal Lending Communities program that CRS has in countries. And so it sets up small groups for people who do not have access to basic banking. It could not meet the requirements to open a bank account or save on that kind of level. And it's most effective in rural communities. Is that something that you think also can add to the resilience and the community building that happens with direct cash programs? Or how do you see that as factoring in to the work that you do? Do you see many Silk programs where you work?
I do, yeah. Silk, or in other organizations, they're called Village Savings and Loans. There's different names for them. It's basically internal savings. So each putting in a certain amount of money each week or each month, sharing out the interest at the end. It's a real way of, for the very poor, of consumption smoothing, of people realizing that they have saved over time. And it's really been, I mean, time and time again, it's like one of the things that comes out of a program that is still going on 10 years later. Because people self-select into their groups and they know each other and they trust each other. And as we're talking about how money is such a thing, people trust each other with their money. That's a really big deal. And that is something that kind of translates into long-term. And over time also, they're able to, initially it's sort of just kind of really being able to meet basic needs. You know, people save like 10 cents a week. It's very minimal, but over time they can actually save quite a bit and make bigger investments into their livelihoods. So I think from what I've seen anyway, that's a really, I mean, what's interesting is it's actually, I mean, Tom Shaw will tell you for a long time that it probably exists best sort of outside of any kind of cash transfer to be injected into it, that it kind of, some of the power of it is that it's a model that is really self-driven. But I do see it as being a really important part of, you know, it really does show resilience. And in terms of what we were talking about earlier about the Give Directly program, where people having this consistent source of funding, of income, it's a slightly different, right? It's not new income, but it's a consistent savings. So it's having something to come back to. So I haven't seen data from COVID, although Tom probably was telling you, but I imagine that those groups that were strong, they had something to go to rely on, to go back on, similar to what at a different level is having like a consistent income, but at least some kind of base base finance. Yeah.
In both cases, there's a reliability, right? That what is it that both internal savings and lendings communities in villages and basic income programs, no matter the country, right? And cash transfer, when you know, right, you know you can rely on it. You're part of a program is that it allows people to plan. And so you're able to plan your academic decisions and plan out, right, whether you're expanding a business or paying for school fees or other things. At least 3 people have written with what I expected as a question, and that is both in the United States. A couple were questions about the United States, and others was at least one person writing about coming from a developing country. Right, the big question is always, well, how are we going to pay for it? That people may grant us on the data for these pilot programs and think basic income is great and think these cash infusions are great, but how are we going? They don't see it as feasible. They don't see it as sustainable. I want to start, Evelyn, at the beginning. You mentioned that there was just, right, a look at what this would mean in Canada, and that this is possible without a significant tax overhaul. And then, Kate, I'll give you a chance to weigh in as someone who studied U.S. policy and inequality programs.
It really very much depends on the context you're in, but I think it's easy to underestimate the amount of money that's already being spent on programs by various levels of government to address poverty in a high-income country. So there was recently a study in one Canadian province, and people counted all of the programs that were being offered by municipalities, by the province, by the federal government to address poverty. Some of them delivered goods in kind, some of them delivered cash, some of them, you know, this whole range of services and cash. And they came up with 192 different programs, 192 in one province. And, you know, you can look at that any way you want to. When I look at that, I think, my goodness, and everyone is governed by a different set of regulations, a different application process, and a different bureaucracy. Surely there's room in there for a little bit of simplification. And I mean, so the question is, what services do we need and what can be transformed into cash? And at least, and again, it really depends on the context, but I don't think in high income countries, there's nearly as much resistance to delivering goods in kind or delivering services as there is to delivering cash to people. We want to give people food vouchers. We don't want to give people money and think that, you know, they have the good sense to go and buy their own food. You know, we want to give landlords rent subsidies. We don't want to give people money and let them find their own housing. So there's a resistance, I think, to cash. So if you look at the funding that's required for all of these programs, and not only the funding to deliver the actual services and the actual amounts of cash, but also the cost of the bureaucracy, the cost of policing people, the cost of the time involved in delivering them, there's a great deal of money that can be repurposed to create a basic income. And as I said, we discovered that at least the Parliamentary Budget Officer came up with a set of, you know, some controversial claims. I mean, there's a lot of conversation to be had about exactly which programs should be folded into a basic income and which should stay as standalone programs. But it's a starting point. And the starting point, I think, is this is feasible. Let's have the conversation about how to do this in the best way possible. I'd be astonished if the same thing weren't also true in the US. I mean, I think that a tremendous amount of money is being spent to deliver programs, some of which have the desired effect, some of which are bound to be totally ineffective, some of which, you know, people aren't even tracking consequences of if you're anything like Canada. So the money's there. It's not an impossibility.
Yeah, in the US, some of our biggest supporters of UBI are libertarians, right? For just that reason that Evelyn is saying, it removes a lot of bureaucracy. There's no need for means testing. It's possible to consolidate programs. And I would also say, you know, the tax rates that we have right now are not enshrined in the Constitution. They can be changed. You know, we know that in the US, we have some of the wealthiest people in the world. Taxing wealthy individuals or companies, I think, would be a good way to pay for UBI. And from a Catholic perspective, money that's being used to help people flourish, you know, and meet their basic needs and achieve their potential and live and contribute to others instead of, you know, working all the time, is money that's being better spent than by sitting in an account enriching someone. And, you know, I would also say again, you know, I can say from an ethical, a Catholic perspective, right? We all have worth, regardless of the work that we do. You're not only a person of worth insofar as you're contributing to the economy, but from a practical level, we are contributing to the economy when we engage in social media. You know, when you make content and put it online, a tech company sells it to other people who look at it, right, and view ads. So there's kind of that argument too, that the way we're contributing to creating economic value is not totally reflected in a job that you go to for wages, right? And UBI, in a sense, recognizes that as well.
Well, and in the United States, our tax structure is not, it's not just that it's not enshrined in the Constitution in that sense, but I mean, comparatively, we're not, as we look at highly developed countries, we are not overtaxed. We're at the lower end of what we as individuals contribute on a sliding scale, with the wealthiest contributing significantly less than they would in any other highly developed country. One of the flip questions is, though, it is one thing to think about what this means in a situation where, right, as Evelyn noted, in Canada, in the United States, there is enough money. It's just that the public priorities we have, not only in how we allocate money for our social programs, but also what we're spending on when we're not spending on social programs as a collected. You know, Congress's budget is a statement of America's priorities for the community. Whether we're comfortable with that is a much deeper question, but that is, in fact, in a democracy, what the public budget is. What ideas do you have? And this is a question for anyone. when we look at countries that are, middle income and less developed countries, where, the question of how are they going to pay for it is a much more complicated thing. The pilot program I mentioned in Kenya isn't funded by the Kenyan government. It's funded by a giant international nonprofit. What does that mean as a challenge? How do you think, or what ideas are there for how we could think about basic income and country-driven cash transfer programs, and how one would pay for them within the global South, within context where their individual governments, for a host of reasons, don't necessarily have the money that would be it's not obvious that they can find the money. Do you think that it's something that shouldn't just rely on them, or is this more of a global question for how we finance the global economy and how things are distributed? I'm curious as to what any of you think on that.
I can answer a part of it, but I do not know the answer to the whole of it. So I'm interested to hear what colleagues say, but two things I was thinking as you were speaking. One is, in a lot of countries, there is some form of social protection system, right? It is flawed often, but there is often something to grab onto. One of the things that we've been working on is how do we link up with, through our program, so any, like our cash program, how do we link up with, piggyback on, work alongside of, support, fill gaps of an existing government social protection system. It sounds, and there are frameworks for it, and there are lots of discussion around it. It sounds like it's something that is very feasible and easy, and in reality, it's really, really hard. It takes a really long time, in the context that we're working in, we're there for a short amount of time sometimes also, and we have high expectations that we can't meet. A lot of times, the most common I would say that we see is, for example, we will use a government list. A government has a list of these are people who we consider vulnerable, and we'll work with that. That's like a kind of a low level, low hanging fruit kind of way of linking up with a local government. But often it's that there's a system that isn't really there. So a lot of those governments get bilateral funding from the World Bank. There's a big push from the World Bank for social protection programming. In the shorter term, what I've seen also is funding from another bilateral government donor like the US, right? Like we'll have a grant program, like you mentioned, the Give Directly program, right? We'll have a grant from the United States government for, from USAID, for example, for a cash transfer program. And then with the aim that over the course of this program, which, an 18-month program, no, but maybe a 3 to 5 year program, that we can be working with local governments and sort of transitioning some of what we're working with over to them. We had some success in Nigeria for this, where they adopted some of the cash programming that our organization was doing, that they kind of adopted it for themselves. That being said, as we know, we just had this huge COVID bill with not a lot of foreign assistance. I'm not making a value judgment about it, but just saying that like there isn't a lot of money really for U.S. government, considering all the need in the U.S., that there isn't as much aid going to that for any kind of long-term program that would really kind of meet that need from the U.S. government. So anyway, just a couple of starting points there. I didn't answer your big question of how how will they do this, but a few thoughts anyway.
I mean, I think absolutely there's a responsibility, right, for those of us who in wealthier countries to help those in poorer countries, not only for ethical reasons, but for the historical reasons that our wealth and their poverty are connected. And when you think about the massive effort that goes into getting in-kind donations from wealthy countries to poor countries, I think if we could just do more to kind of spread the good news of cash assistance and how effective it is, there's so much that could be done.
I think the hard part of all of this, of course, is how you form organizations to facilitate some of this. So if you look at the World Health Organization, for example, which has a tiny, tiny little budget, given the size of the responsibilities available to it. If you look at these international organizations, how do we go about enforcing suggestion that a lot of companies in the global north, for example, make a lot of money out of mining in the south, or out of setting up and conducting business activities in the south? How do we encourage or incentivize or coerce, or whatever language you want to use, these companies to actually contribute in ways that compensate for the value that they're removing from these companies? And can we use our international organizations to do it? And I'm asking it as a question because I don't know the answer to that. I think that there's a lot of resistance. I mean, we've benefited for a very long time. And we in the North have benefited for a very long time. I mean, our wealth comes from the way the world is arranged. And there's certainly going to be resistance to any suggestion that there should be a different way of sharing the resources that come from it. But I mean, I certainly think that one of the consequences of COVID is going to be a re-examination of the World Health Organization at the very least, and maybe some of these other organizations alongside it. Whether that'll lead to a better outcome, I don't know.
Thank you. It also, my own experience and my own area of research, I know more about particularly East Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa than other parts of the global South. But more money leaves, more wealth is extracted, and I use that word intentionally, from and leaves Africa across the continent than comes into it in any form of aid, or even direct investment in terms of international businesses. They take more out than they put in. And so I think personally, as an ethicist, I think I share Evelyn's skepticism about changing things but I also think that the question of whether or not less developed countries could pay for something like a basic income and have better social protection supports really comes, a key part of that is if the highly developed countries and all of their actors, so transnational corporations that are based out of them, if we stopped getting in the way, and this is where Pope Francis has made a big deal about talking about various forms of tax evasion on a global scale as a profound moral evil and social sin. And I think, I think that's to the couple of people who asked the question, I agree that, to think about countries that are struggling to how would they pay for more extensive programs like this, is the answer is not in the way that the economic world is structured now, but how do we restructure? And that does mean removing power, reassessing who has power and control, and creating situations where communities are agents of their own destiny. And a key part of that, I think, that is related to what we've been talking about, is tax evasion and other forms of extracting both wealth and resources from other countries. We are just about at the end of time. At the end of all of our events, there's a link in the chat that is part of CRS's current advocacy program in terms of advocating for development funding for hunger programs. The COVID-19 bill has passed, and so this is really a way to keep pushing and keep the pressure on elected representatives to make sure, given the needs domestically, that global development and global aid continues to remain part of all of these relief bills and discussions, and isn't something that is put on the chopping block. So you can see a link in the chat that should be visible to all attendees, as well as a code that you can text CRSU Hunger to 30644 in order to, on your smartphone, get the link, because I know that is easier sometimes for people. And I know that everybody, I've been getting a bunch of private chat messages to me as host, as people say, thank you for great presentations. This has been full of important information. So I know that everybody joins me in thanking our incredible panel. I am so grateful to Evelyn, Dina, and Kate for agreeing to spend time with us this evening. I hope that this is the first of many conversations that I get to have with all of you. And I want to alert everyone that tomorrow, most likely, the recording from this will be up on our YouTube channel, St. John's CRS Global Campus Committee's YouTube channel, along with all of the other panels from this academic year and a couple from last year as well. Thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you again to my wonderful panel. I hope everyone has a good night.